Starting, all attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon for those of you not joining us here on the West Coast. My name is Basil Sadek. I'm the Marketing Associate here at VolunteerMatch, and I want to welcome you to our Nonprofit Insight Series. Today, VolunteerMatch President Greg Baldwin will share common challenges nonprofits face when screening volunteers, based on 2 surveys we ran that gauged the attitudes and perceptions of nonprofit screening practices across America. Before I turn this over, I did want to go over just a few housekeeping notes. First off, all of you are on an automatic mute this morning, so you don't need to worry about any background noise on your part. Just because we can't hear your voice doesn't mean we don't want to hear from you. You should see a go-to webinar toolbar in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. Once you open that up, you'll see the word questions with either a plus sign or an arrow sign next to it, and that's your questions tool. Please feel free to type in your questions as we go through today's webinar, and we'll take a couple of breaks to start answering them. I'm also going to be live tweeting, so if you're on Twitter and would like to ask a question there or join in the conversation, you can do so by using the hashtag VMLearn, as in VolunteerMatchLearn. All right, let's get started. For those of you who are not familiar with our service, VolunteerMatch believes everyone should have the chance to make a difference. As the web's largest volunteer engagement network, we serve over 113,000 participating nonprofits and 13 million annual visitors. We also offer solutions for individuals, nonprofits, and companies to make our mission a reality. Since our launch in 1998, VolunteerMatch has helped the social sector attract more than $10.4 billion worth of volunteer services. Are you new to the field of volunteer management, or are you looking to expand your knowledge? Our Learning Center offers over 20 webinar topics focused on the field and serves an audience of over 8,000 attendees each year. Okay, that's a bit about VolunteerMatch. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our speakers today. Greg Baldwin is the president of VolunteerMatch. Greg joined the founding team here at VolunteerMatch in 1998 as its Chief Imagination Officer. Today, he oversees the expansion of our network. Greg graduated from Brown University in 1990 with a BA in Public Policy. He's a lifelong volunteer and lives here in the Bay Area with his wife, Catherine, and 2 kids, Ellie and Matt. We also have Naomi Inman on the webinar today. She works as a nonprofit consultant, professional writer, and freelance journalist based out of Portland, Oregon. She will also be guiding us through today's presentation. And last but certainly not least, we have Katie Mims. She is a background research and relationship manager over at SureID. She works with background screening suppliers around the country to provide effective security solutions for nonprofits and volunteers alike. All right, good morning, guys. How's everyone doing?
Good morning, Basil. Good morning, Greg.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Naomi, will you get us started and take it away?
I will take it away. And thanks for that tremendous introduction, Basil, and for all of your work to make these VolunteerMatch webinars as successful as they are. Greg, I am so excited to be here with you today, and I appreciate your leadership in the volunteer space and the nonprofit space. Welcome to this webinar.
Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Hey, this issue of identity assurance is one that your organization has recently taken pretty strong lead on. Can you tell us why this is so important to you and your leadership at VolunteerMatch?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, obviously nonprofits that we serve depend on finding amazing volunteers to help them advance their mission. It's the lifeblood of the nonprofit sector. And in an increasingly complicated and changing world, one of the topics that doesn't always get the attention it deserves is how do you effectively screen volunteers to make sure that the folks that you're working with have your organization's best interests at heart.
That's for sure. And you conducted a couple surveys. I was thinking, I'm not even sure that a survey of this nature has really been done amongst nonprofits and volunteers, asking them about their background screening processes. So what was it in the surveys that you were hoping to find, and why did you guys conduct them?
That's a great question. I think there's no better way to find out what's going on in the marketplace and with the nonprofits and volunteers than to just ask them. So together with you and the team, we put together a survey that we fielded to understand what the attitudes and perceptions of nonprofits are with regard to screening and background checking, learn a little bit more about what's working, what's not working, get underneath some of the myths and misperceptions, and really to focus the conversation moving forward really on what are some of the new solutions that nonprofits and volunteers can look to as they're looking to get involved with great organizations all across the country.
Yeah, that's a great answer, Greg. And we do, we know a lot about background screens in the past and the way they've been done, but there's definitely new solutions and there's new ways to think about screening, and there's also new technologies coming to us even as we speak. So we're going to dive into the next slide here, and we're going to start looking at who took the nonprofit screening survey, and then we're going to look at who took the volunteer screening survey. So I'm just going to do a quick run through. We asked questions and over 640 nonprofits responded, and we saw that about 20% of them employ volunteer staff only, which I thought was interesting, and half have about a dozen employees or more, and 3/4 have a pretty small budget. And I know that background screening and identity checking can kind of cut into that at times. What is the important thing to know about the nonprofits represented in this survey?
I mean, I think the most important thing is for folks on the call that we represent. The survey represented a wide cross section of nonprofits all across the country, big and small. And I think it's really important that we're surveying folks that aren't the big. This isn't just the big $50 million, $100 million nonprofits. These are local organizations that we serve every day who have limited budgets and are trying to do their best to serve their communities and serve their constituents without massive budgets behind them. And we get it.
Right. When we look at our volunteer survey, I'm going to switch over to the volunteer survey next. We had 2,200 volunteer responses, and about half of these volunteers, or greater than half, volunteer in more than one organization. They volunteer several times per year, and almost half volunteer at least once a month, and some even said they volunteer several times per week, and we even had a few that said they volunteer several times per day. These are very active volunteers. Did this survey tell you anything new about them, about our volunteers?
We've been serving for so long. It's just a reminder of how amazing people can be when they're asked to serve. That is clear to me. I mean, folks that are volunteering, twice a week or more, it's just a remarkable community of folks that are out there looking to give back to their community. And again, with 2,200 responses, the public policy major in me, the data geek, knows that's a pretty big survey. So the results that we're taking a look at here are definitely, it's a nice cross section of the U.S. And represents the voice of the volunteers pretty successfully, I think.
Right. By reviewing the surveys, we are going to be taking a look at how nonprofits are currently vetting volunteers, and we're going to include answers from volunteers as well and what their attitudes were about receiving identity and background checks. I just want to remind our attendees that we are going to be inviting your questions for Greg and the challenges that you encounter in maybe vetting and screening process at your organization. And we're even going to take a couple opportunities throughout the webinar to address your questions. I want to give a quick reminder that we invite you, as Basil mentioned, to join us on Twitter at VolunteerMatch, and you can participate in the VolunteerMatch Twitter poll, which is going to be asking whether or not you conduct background screenings at your nonprofit organization. So we're looking right now at a nonprofit survey about verifying identity. First of all, verifying identity refers to this whole process of verifying a person's identity to gain confidence that the volunteer is who they claim to be. And in the world of nonprofits, every relationship matters, and even one bad interaction can jeopardize an organization's future. So you can see there that when it comes to verifying identity, that a very small percentage do not verify identity, and most verify with information that the volunteer provides. They can provide a name and email address or a photo ID or fingerprints. And that we also noticed that nonprofits had a pretty strong level of concern about identity insurance, meaning they want to know that the paperwork being handed to them or the volunteer who is presenting at their organization is who they claim to be and that there isn't any hidden information. We also looked at familiarity with background check services, like how familiar are nonprofits with the services that they're using. And there seemed to be a pretty good chunk, about 29%, with zero to low familiarity with their services. So that was a really good indicator that there's some work to do. And then we also looked at the screening techniques that nonprofits are currently using today to verify the identity of their volunteers. What do you find encouraging, Greg, about these responses from nonprofits? And then where do you see room for awareness?
So when you look at, verifying identity, it's pretty clear that nonprofits are pretty clear that, understanding that the person that they're working with is the person that they say they are is something that is clear is a real, issue. Issues might not be quite the right word, but it's something that they're aware of. Like, of course, you're not going to want to have someone show up and volunteer as if they're somebody else. And that nonprofits have some systems in place to try and check that. I think what the conversation is really about is, are those systems really adequate and succeeding at what they set out to do, which is to verify that the folks that are volunteering with your organization are who they say they are. And when you're doing background screenings or checking, that you're doing the background screenings and checking on the right person, and that those screening techniques are effective.
Right, and doing the right background screen on the right person is key, isn't it? In our next section, in the news, Greg, I know that you're familiar with recent news about Uber, and I wonder if you could give us a quick perspective on the importance of how physically verifying somebody's identity rather than having them simply fill out a paper or an online form can make a huge difference in the identity verification process.
Yeah, and this is kind of the headline we're all hoping to avoid here in the nonprofit sector. But Uber, who's been in the news for lots of things recently, had claimed that they had some trouble with drivers, and were trying to assure the public that they had done everything they can to provide state-of-the-art background checking services for their drivers. But it turned out that their state-of-the-art background checking service didn't really involve verifying that the people that were doing the people that were submitting information for the background check were the people that the background checks were actually being run on. So I think the news item that we're talking about here was that I think it was the state of Washington, the state actually did some background checks using fingerprints instead of the system that Uber was using, and found that a large and significant chunk of the folks that had been cleared by Uber were not being cleared when they did a background check using fingerprints, which found criminal background activity in their records. So it just proves the point that you can do background checking well and you can do background checking poorly, and one of the key ingredients is having a reliable system for ensuring that the person who is filling out the form for the background check is actually the person that you're running the background screen on. And in this case, fingerprints is is one of the best ways to do that.
Right, and we can see there on the screen that when a separate, physical verification process was enacted, that 11% of the 71,000 drivers failed the identity verification. That's a really high number. It's a sobering number, and it's also a great reminder to us that physical verification is a huge piece of the process. One more thing in the news I thought it was interesting was that Orrin Hatch wants to add more teeth to the National Child Protection Act, which is came out in 1993, I believe. But he himself realized the importance and has a bipartisan bill to make sure that all child care providers can access nationwide background checks. And that is saying that when you are background checking on a child care provider, that you're making sure that you're doing a national search on that provider, that you're physically verifying them, and that the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, when they conducted background checks, 6% of their volunteers had criminal backgrounds.
Yeah. I think that's, keep going, sorry.
So just your comments, Greg, on what this Hatch bill tells you about the importance of physical verification.
Well, I think, first and foremost, it's good to see that, the Senate is paying attention to some of these issues. This is a bill that I think will really acknowledge that with nonprofits that are working with children in vulnerable populations, we can't accept a system that has a failure rate of as much as 6% or 10%. And that is, I think it's a good sign to see that government is working on this. Now, the bill has not been passed yet, so I think at this point now it's really more of just an acknowledgement that the systems that a lot of nonprofits are relying on to screen their volunteers are only working at about 94% success rate on this one test that the Center for Missing and Exploited Children ran.
Right, and you'll see that that's a very recent headline within the last month. Well, we felt, Greg, that it is important for nonprofits to know how our volunteers feel about being verified themselves. And we asked them, if they were more likely to volunteer for an organization that requires identity verification. And overwhelmingly, on a scale of, we had done a different scale of 0 to 10, with 10 being more likely to volunteer and 0 being less likely to volunteer if they were asked to verify identity. Volunteers gave us an 8 on that. So 8 out of 10 were more likely to volunteer. And then 91% of volunteers did not have any negative feelings. You'll see a small number there that expressed either a strongly negative or negative impact when they were asked about that. But 91% of volunteers either expressed neutral or positive feelings about identity verification. Why is this important for nonprofit leaders to know about how their volunteers feel?
For me, I think this is probably the most important, maybe one of the most important findings from the survey. It's easy to believe that volunteers are uncomfortable with the process of a state-of-the-art, sophisticated, well-done background check. It's very easy to believe that, and I will confess that at times I think I have held that assumption that doing a background check is invasive and will make people uncomfortable. But most of all, it will discourage volunteers from volunteering at your organization. And I think the facts and the data shows that the exact opposite is true, and that when you share this with volunteers, they actually are more likely to want to volunteer with an organization that is doing appropriate background checks, which I think is really counterintuitive, or could be counterintuitive, and it was for me. And I hope that this survey work will help more nonprofits feel less comfortable or feel more comfortable and not be uncomfortable about doing the appropriate background checks to protect their organization and their constituents.
Yeah, it is important to know that. It's probably, I think, one of the common challenges that nonprofits have faced in the past is just knowing how their volunteers feel about it and honestly being worried about scaring volunteers away. So on this challenge, this is a great time to take questions from our attendees, questions about verifying identity or the challenges they faced in the process. And Basil, do you have any questions from the audience for Greg? And I would also like you to remind us about the Twitter poll. We want to know, do you currently run criminal or background checks? Basil, how could they take the Twitter poll? And I'm wondering if we have any questions.
All right, thanks, Naomi. We actually got a couple of really good questions in that I'm very excited to go ahead and ask you guys. But before we do, on Twitter, we asked all of you because we really want to know, we want to get a sense of your current background screening practices at your nonprofit. So on Twitter, we pushed out a poll earlier where we asked, do you currently run criminal or background checks on volunteers? So far, 11 of you have already taken the poll and weighed in, which is fantastic. 45% of you say yes on all volunteers. That's great to hear. 33% say yes on some volunteers, and 25% say no on no volunteers. If you said no, let us know why via the questions toolbar, and we'd love to share your response with the rest of our listeners today. If you have not taken the Twitter poll, the easiest way to do it is type twitter.com/volunteermatch in your browser window, and it should be it should either be the first or the second tweet up there. All right, moving on to questions. Like I was saying earlier, we got some great questions in. One of our listeners, Shireen, asked, what does criminal mean when we say criminal background checks? Is that something small or is it something more serious like sexual abuse? Could we maybe clarify what we mean when we say criminal background check?
You know, I am going to invite Katie Mims, our SureID subject matter expert on that question. That is a great question. What does the criminal mean, Katie?
Sure. So it can mean a few things. Really depends on what type of background screening package is set up. And we'll get into a little bit more of what the SureID solution offers, but it can be anything from misdemeanor convictions, felony convictions. It could be the sex offender registry or anything like that.
So anything that qualifies as criminal under the law, be it a misdemeanor, all the way to something more serious.
Right, and that would vary depending on the background screen that the nonprofit organization is running and with the grading criteria they've selected.
All righty. Great answer, Katie. Basil, any other questions?
Yeah, that was a great answer. Thanks, Katie. Another one of our listeners, Ashley, says she's worked with volunteers who've expressed anxiety about conducting background checks because of minor issues from long ago that they fear would keep them from volunteering. How would either Naomi or Greg, how would you guys recommend curbing those anxieties?
You know,
Greg,
I'll take this one. And this is something that I think is important to keep in the conversation as we move forward. Every nonprofit is going to handle the information that they get back from a background screen differently. So, for instance, it's a policy issue whether or not, you know, someone who may have had a misdemeanor, in college for, whatever it may be, whether that should or shouldn't disqualify them from being a volunteer. And I think every organization, what we all have in common, though, is we don't want to have any surprises. And I think as an organization, what we're talking about here is making sure that you get accurate information about the volunteer. But every organization can decide whether or not that information is going to disqualify a volunteer from serving. So I know this is a relevant information. This is relevant for job positions as well. So I think what we're talking about here is making sure that nonprofits have the information so they can make good decisions, and not having something that happened in somebody's past automatically disqualify them from volunteering. It's just that needs to be part of the conversation. Does that make sense?
Basil, is there any other zinger questions you have for us today?
Let's go ahead and do one more question, and then we'll take another break later on in today's webinar.
Sure.
One of our listeners, Jennifer, asked, what documents would you consider proof of identity?
Great question. I'm going to have Katie answer that question because it is important to know what documents are considered proof of identity.
Sure, and with the Sure ID solution, there is a number of different accepted IDs. I think mainly what's asked for at the enrollment station is going to be the driver's license, passport, state ID, something along those lines, and then we also ask for a secondary form of ID. And when the individual goes to the enrollment station, they'll be able to review the list of acceptable identity documents and prepare to have those with them.
Mm-hmm. And the screening part of what's involved in that is a whole nother conversation, but that is a great question to begin with. All right, moving on. We're going to take that was a different sound there, excuse me. We're going to move on to the next section of our webinar addressing background checks, how nonprofits conduct background checks and how volunteers feel about them. Background checks provide a criminal record screening so that you know who you can trust to volunteer for your organization. We can see that about 32% of organizations, for one reason or another, do not run background checks on volunteers, and that a majority of our nonprofits have concerns about volunteers being trustworthy. Close to 80% show at least some level of concern about knowing that the background screen that they've run really is accurate. And again, we can see that nonprofits who run recurring background checks are in the minority. About 1/3 of them do recurring background screens for one reason or another, and then about 2/3 simply perform a one-time background check. Greg, what are your thoughts on recurring screens, and when do you think organizations might want to consider adding a regular reporting to their process?
I think this is one of the ones that for me was a new piece of information. I'd always thought like if you'd done a background check, then you should be done and on you go. But it's pretty clear that if you have a volunteer pool that has been serving for many years, without a recurring background check, it would be hard to know what their current status is. And so as you get smarter about what good screening would look like, I think recurring checks is just an important piece of the puzzle to ensure that the people that you're working with are the people that you want to have working with you as volunteers.
Yes, recurring screens can save a lot of heartache, I believe, especially in particular populations that we're working with as nonprofits. And you and I, when we were preparing for this webinar, one story came across our desk, and I'm talking to you from Portland, Oregon, and this story just happened within the last year. And I wonder if you can speak to it and how a recurring check would have the power to make a huge difference in a situation like this one.
Yeah, as you can see on the slide, this was a really unfortunate situation where there's a guy who began volunteering I think in 2012, and he's working for a youth service organization. And in 2013, there was some charges that this person is convicted of a crime, and there's no way for the nonprofit to find out about that. And it happens nearby, and it's just one of those tragic situations where bad processes resulted in a volunteer able to continue to serve in an organization where it was clearly inappropriate for that person to continue to be serving.
Yeah, and it went on for, I think it said the abuse went on for 4 years, during that time of which he had been participating in criminal activity and no screening had occurred. And it is just tragic. And one thing I wanted to point out when I was reading this story is that if we look at somebody's profile and look at them and consider trustworthiness simply on the basis of profile, this man ran the local coffee shop that was the hangout. He was a youth pastor. He was married. His wife was probably completely clueless about any of activity. So trustworthiness goes much deeper than just outward appearances, doesn't it, Greg?
Yeah, I mean, that's the hard part about, I think, this conversation. It's that, our gut isn't necessarily a good guide to, what's happening in people's lives. And not knowing about that is just, there's too much room for bad things to happen in the world that we live in today.
Right. And so, again, we wanted to hear how volunteers felt about the whole background screening process, because apart from verifying identity and wanting to know that the person in front of us is who they say they are, we really want to know that everything in their background, whether we want to know what it is, first place, but we also want to know that if there are any discrepancies, that they've been forthcoming about it, because a lot of times the disqualifiers of their past, I believe, can be the best qualifiers for them working with young people. But if there's any inconsistencies or something that appears hidden, that's really where the red flags come about, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's, to the earlier question, I think that's a really important that's really important. It's not that having a criminal background would necessarily disqualify you from working with, at-risk kids. It's the unwillingness of the volunteer or the, kind of lack of awareness of the nonprofit that is part of the volunteer's background.
Right. So when we asked volunteers, again, how they felt about background checks, about 3/4 surveyed have received a background check. And when asked again about whether they would be more likely to volunteer for an organization that requires background checks, we got a solid 8 out of 10 on that. And then also 91% of volunteers expressed neutral to positive feelings about background checks, meaning about 8 or 9% said that it would impact them negatively. When you looked at this question, how volunteers felt about background screens, what does it tell you again?
I think it underscores that, contrary to what, people may think, volunteers, when they understand what's going on and they're educated about it, they're ready to step up and be a part of the solution.
Yeah, I really think they are. And I think they might consider it just an extra level of transparency and support for their organization. Again, we're going to look at some common challenges and take questions from our audience. Common challenges that some nonprofits have had in the background screening process, whether they've had a hard time getting the best information available, or if they lack familiarity with how their background screening works, or we had talked about cost and inconvenience. The reason that background screens sometimes don't happen is because nonprofits find them costly and inconvenient. So, Basil, I want you to remind us again what the Twitter poll is doing and if you've received any great questions for Greg.
Thanks, Naomi. Let's get started with questions, and then we'll move over to the Twitter poll. I will also share a link to today's poll in the GoToWebinar chat box. So if you have not weighed in yet, there's still time to do so, and you'll see the link shortly. All right, we have a couple of really relevant questions, and a lot of great questions. You guys are really asking the right stuff. One of our listeners, Jesse, says, for international students who want to come and volunteer at an organization, can they use a student visa as their background check? Ooh, tough one.
That is a tough one, and that's a zinger.
Yeah.
Katie, what has been our experience with internationals?
That is actually something that I would have to look into a little bit more. I believe that we do accept some international documents on our acceptable list for identification purposes, but I do know there has to be 2 documents provided.
Wow, that's a good one.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Jesse, if you want to follow up with us after the webinar, we're happy to provide you some more information on that question.
And also, Katie is a great background researcher, so she will research this issue. What's another great question, Basil?
I'm going to throw another difficult one your way, guys. But if we can't answer this during today's webinar, we're happy to answer it after. Also, another very time-relevant one. So, Carsey asks, how do you address the issue of volunteers who really want to help but are undocumented?
Ooh, that is a good one.
I think Greg, do you have any answers to that? Because I think, we're getting into some territory that is a little bit out of the realm of the standard verification process.
Yeah, I think this is going to be one of those situations where, every nonprofit is going to have to, take a look at all of its policies and how it's thinking about who it wants and who it's really looking for to serve. And I think different organizations are going to have, different responses to it. And I think this is going to become a variable that increasingly nonprofits are going to have to do their best to make sure that, the folks that they're volunteering with, even if they were undocumented with regard to citizenship, that there isn't so much uncertainty about who they are as people and whether or not they're a good fit with your organization, and whether or not, as a nonprofit, you feel comfortable that you know enough about this volunteer to invite them to be a part of your organization. And maybe you have to, carve out some particular roles where they would be appropriate and others where they wouldn't.
Right, exactly. It can depend on the role for sure. And I'd like to move ahead and quickly wrap up this webinar. I love these questions. I love the engagement of the audience today, and really think, what those questions tell me, Greg, is that people are really thinking ahead and thinking seriously about who they're going to let into their organization.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think this is an important conversation to have, and we're getting some data and getting some real questions. And that's great. The more solutions-oriented we all are, the better.
So our next section, really quick, is going to be on who's making the decisions. And those kind of questions that we had are very much board-level decision-making questions, don't you think?
Yeah, at board and executive level, certainly, top of the organizations having to deal with policies that affect everyone in the organization.
Right. We're seeing that primarily the board or HR departments are the ones making these decisions. And then we also are learning that 87% of the nonprofits surveyed are paying for the background checks. And then we also learned that 75% of nonprofits who are not doing background checks are saying that it's expensive or inconvenient. And I wonder if you can speak to those reasons for not doing background screens and speak to why we should be having this discussion.
Yeah, I think, obviously, if, something terrible will happen to your organization because a volunteer joined who, wasn't who they said they were and was a convicted criminal, and you've got them working with kids or vulnerable populations, those are real questions, and it's not okay to, just kind of sweep them under the carpet anymore. So I think, any organization that's not doing any background screening, there are certainly organizations that are doing work that don't require background screenings, but everyone's going to have to answer that for themselves. And I think that money really increasingly just can't be an excuse not to do the right thing. And I think one of the things that we're certainly seeing in our research work, and a different way to frame the financial challenges for nonprofits, is to really invite the volunteers to consider contributing as part of their gift to the organization. Nonprofits and volunteers need to work together on finding solutions. And I think volunteers are actually far more willing to contribute and support financially the organizations where they volunteer. And if they understand what the challenges are, we really think changing the frame to invite the volunteers to be a part of the solution is something more nonprofits need to look at, particularly those who aren't doing what they think they should be doing just because of cost.
Right, and it does reframe the conversation quite a bit. You know, when we ask nonprofits what features they would really like to see in an identity assurance or a physical credential, we came up with a list and a pretty strong showing that at least half of nonprofits saw the value in things like identity verification, collecting biometrics, recurring background checks, and having a visible credential. Some of these are newer things, maybe newer models for the nonprofit world, but many of these features are well known in the commercial and business world. Why are they somewhat new to nonprofits from your experience, Greg?
Yeah, I mean, I think they really are. I mean, I've only really started getting educated about this subject over the past couple of years. And I have learned that, you know, many of these systems and processes and features are fairly commonplace in the business world. And I think they're now just becoming available at, you know, in the nonprofit sector and in the nonprofit world at scale. I think, you know, some of the costs associated with doing these things in the past have been a lot higher. And as new solutions evolve and emerge, I think the price points have come down and made them more relevant features and options for the nonprofit sector.
Yeah, they definitely so. And when we asked volunteers again, as we're landing back to what the volunteers feel about this, we found that well over half, because this is a new concept, and so I saw a lot of neutrals in there, meaning when you see a large neutral on a survey like this, often it's because you've just introduced a new concept that people aren't familiar with. So when we asked volunteers about their interest in owning a digital identity or a background check that they can use at multiple purposes, well over half expressed some interest in having this kind of a digital identity. What is the best thing about this different model that we're talking about than we've typically used in the past?
Well, for those of us who volunteer a lot, and I'm sure, well, we know that many of the folks who are using VolunteerMatch are those folks who volunteer at more than one organization. You'll know what a hassle it is to have to do background checks at more than one organization, even if you just had a background check done. And I do think it could be, a really important transformation in the space if more volunteers were able to just get a credential that was accepted at thousands of organizations and just bring that credential, and instead of having to run a background check every time, they'd just be able to show their up-to-date credentials. And it would streamline the process for everybody and reduce the cost.
One other question that we asked the volunteers was back to this idea of recurring screens. We asked the volunteers about their willingness to pay a monthly subscription. That, again, is a brand new idea. And I think one thing that really surprised us was that 80% of the volunteers who responded said yes, that they would be willing to pay $4.95 a month to subscribe to a recurring background check. Did that surprise you?
Yeah, it does. But again, a lot of this has surprised me that, how willing volunteers are to just be a part of the solution, and that money isn't, once people understand what's going on, people are willing to spend money to be a part of a real solution. And I think this just kind of underscores that.
It does underscore it. And it was surprising to me when I was reviewing these survey results. Well, we're winding up here, and we're going to be handing this over to our subject matter expert at SureID that can tell us a little bit more about what's involved in background screens and the verification process. And today we've talked about the role identity assurance can play in mitigating risk and what some of the common challenges are. We've looked at volunteer attitudes And we're going to be looking at a nationwide identity assurance solution that nonprofits and volunteers can consider. We've heard from you, Greg, and your decades of experience on nonprofits and volunteer engagement. And I so appreciate really your lifelong service to this part of our economy, of our world, people helping people. I want to thank you so much for that.
Yeah, thank you.
I want to point out one thing before we pass off to Katie, and that is back in March, VolunteerMatch issued a press release announcing a partnership with SureID, and you had the goal of raising national awareness amongst nonprofits and volunteers for the need to establish a high assurance for identity in their organization amongst their volunteers. Why is it that VolunteerMatch took this step to partner with SureID?
I mean, there's a lot of reasons, and I think, coming out of this most recent election cycle, I think it's become increasingly clear to me that anonymity in the modern world is a bad thing. You just have to take a look at your average Twitter, Twitter beef, or the comments in a Facebook thread. When there's room for anonymity, those conversations become enormously unpleasant really, really quickly. And you've got trolls and all sorts of terrible things online. And I think underneath it all, it's the problems of anonymity. When people aren't, who they have no requirement to be who they say they are, it really tends to, it seems it's bringing out the worst in people. And I think it's really important as we move into the 21st century, I believe, that all of these amazing nonprofit organizations that our communities depend on don't get stuck suffering from some of the worst case scenarios that we've been seeing online. Identity is important, it matters, and it's only going to become more important in the 21st century as people have more mobility and people move around a lot more. And so I think I'm proud that we are opening up these conversations and doing some real research so that nonprofits can continue to rely on the volunteers that they need moving forward and have some better solutions for supporting their amazing work.
Thank you, Greg. In an increasingly complicated world, it still comes down to one-on-one connection, knowing that the person in front of you is who they say they are, and knowing what their background contains and what their motivations are to work with your organization. And so that's why we are looking at this issue and why we've invited Katie Mims from SureID to just help us with some insight into how background screens work and the process that SureID is implementing to add these credentials to volunteers and nonprofits nationwide. Katie, tell us a little bit about SureID.
So SureID has been around for a number of years, and they have a lot of experience with identity validation, identity management, and using background screens for a number of different products. So the solution that they've come up with for the SureID Certified Edge for volunteers is a solution that I think will go ahead and address a number of the topics that you guys have discussed. As you can see here, there's a little bit of history of SureID and some information about that.
So Katie, tell me a little bit about what's involved in a background screen. We don't have time to go through this very long list, but you can just tell us the rigor that's involved in our background.
Sure. We have a very thorough screen. One of the important things that I will point out that addresses one of the topics you guys were speaking is the name and address history development. So we do a 7-year development. So that will go and find all the addresses that this person has lived at in the last 7 years. And then we go and do a criminal county search at each of the counties that they've lived in, along with all the rest of the searches that you see here. And that's done in our initial package. We also offer the recurring screen, which is conducted quarterly. And this really lowers the risk by making sure the individual is still in good standing every quarter.
Great. And then what are some disqualifying criteria and how do those come about?
So with the Social Security validation, there is a chance that someone used an invalid Social Security number. We, of course, can look for registered sex offenders. Any open outstanding criminal warrant would disqualify someone, along with felony and misdemeanor convictions. However, with this, we do have a redress process where the individual, whether they pass or fail, is going to get to see their report, and it's up to them if they want to share it to move forward with the program. And they have the opportunity to redress, correct their records with the background screen provider.
I imagine once in a while things come up that people didn't even know were on there, or maybe got on there in the wrong way. So it's actually a great process for some that adds transparency, I think, to the applicant. So tell us a little bit about how this product works and how in-person registration would work for volunteers and nonprofits.
Right. So the registration process does start. It can start at the individual's home computer, it can start on their device, smartphone, anything like that. But the second step is on-site, so in-person registration, which really helps out making sure we know who this person is. After that, once they've submitted their identity documents, they're submitted to our team of highly trained individuals that have validated over 200,000 individuals in the past for other products. After the identity is verified, that's when we begin the background screen. So that's when we make sure that we are back screening the right person. Once that's completed, if that's a successful pass of a background screen, then the credential is then printed and shipped to the person. And then once they have the credential, the organization can scan to validate the credential. And as you see here, you can see what it looks like for when an individual has an active past background screen. There's a number of features to the Smartcard Credential, and the organization will be able to download the app to scan the card to check the status of the background screen.
Great. Thank you so much, Katie, for all of that. And a quick reminder, if anyone was curious, the way that SureID Certified Edge has set up this initial time of screening. It's a one-time process. So people get in there one time, they give all their information, and then it's good at multiple organizations. And it starts at $19.95 with a monthly screen of $4.95. And then if organizations were interested in, as a nonprofit, and enrolling the organization to start recognizing the SureID credential, you could see it at info.sureid.com/nonprofits. And volunteers themselves could register for their personal credential at info.sureid.com/volunteermatch-volunteers. So Basil, can you help us wrap up our wonderful program today and thank our audience for the time that we spent together, for their great questions. Greg, I appreciate so much all that you've done to take some leadership in this space within the nonprofit sector, and all of your work at VolunteerMatch.
Thank you. Great. Naomi, do we have a couple of minutes for some more questions?
I think we have about 2 or 3 minutes for a couple questions, and I guess I'll just watch the clock, and when it's, we'll just have to cut it off, or maybe you can watch the clock for me, Basil.
Sounds good. Because really we did get so many great questions during today's webinar. You guys are super engaged, and I'm really impressed with all of the questions that are coming out. One of our listeners, and this one's for you, Greg, one of our listeners asked, when do you choose to run a background check? Is it done for all of your volunteers, or is it only done for volunteers that maybe directly work face-to-face with clients, like seniors or children or residents, et cetera?
Yeah, that's going to differ for every organization. But for instance, if I were running a nonprofit organization and I was doing a beach day cleanup, I probably wouldn't incur the expense of a background check. But if I'm running a Boys and Girls Club or a Junior Achievement, Big Brothers or Big Sisters, or a program that has direct one-on-one interaction with kids, I would definitely be, doing a much more sophisticated background screening and a background check on those volunteers. In some places, it's required. So sometimes it's just the law, but I think increasingly it's just a good practice for organizations if they're going to be inviting and encouraging volunteers to work, particularly one-on-one with youth.
Great. Yeah, it really sounds like it's a case-by-case basis, and that volunteer managers should use their discretion based on the volunteer position, right? Great answer. Thanks, Greg.
Yeah.
Another question. One of our listeners asked, how do you handle volunteers that don't want to or don't necessarily feel comfortable taking a background check? What advice do you give them?
To the nonprofit organizations, my advice would be, look, try to have some roles at your organization where you might be comfortable with someone that has no background check, so have an option available, but certainly don't, you need to have these conversations up front, and if you have policies in place and you have a real need and a requirement for a background screening, I think a volunteer has a choice, and if, there's thousands of other places that they could go volunteer that don't require a background check, but certainly don't diminish your, undermine your own capacity to properly screen volunteers just because a volunteer is uncomfortable with it. Explain to them what's going on, give them the choice, and if they elect not to move ahead, then that's okay.
Great. This next question, and I think we have time for just one more question, and then we'll go ahead and wrap up. But this next question is for you, Katie, and one of our listeners wants to know, what's wrong with just asking a volunteer to bring in their driver's license and use that as proof of identity? Could you maybe speak a little about to that?
Sure. I think this is something that, with the number of years of experience that SureID has had in identity validation and verification, that I think this is something that they've developed a process that really will ensure that they can validate the identity for the person. So I think that's something they've figured out is one is not enough, and it's an extra step to be able to make sure that this is the person that they say they are.
So that that people are faking their licenses, and that's what the experience you've learned from? Is that what it is? Or using somebody else's?
Yeah, I mean, I think that could be a situation that's happened, which has led to the current process that we have now.
Got it. Thanks.
Great, fantastic. Thank you so much, Greg, Naomi, and Katie. To our listeners, if your question didn't get answered, please forward them along to the great folks at SureID. Their contact information is provided in the follow-up email, which you will receive approximately 1 hour from now. Also, this webinar is being recorded and will be up on our YouTube channel in the next couple of hours as well. So if you'd like to revisit parts of the webinar or even jot down some notes from the survey, you may do so there. Again, you'll receive an email with us in about an hour. That email will also have some more information about SureID Certified Edge. I wanted to thank Naomi, Katie, and Greg again, and thank you to our listeners for attending. We hope to see you all on a future VolunteerMatch webinar. Bye-bye.